Thanks for joining me for this second video on the Canon R5, which is a bit of an adventure for me because I'm dipping my toe into the world of mirrorless cameras for the first time, and I invite you to come along if you have the interest. Now, many of us of senior years may be in a slightly better financial position to afford a camera like the Canon R5, but maybe there's some concern that we're likely to be overwhelmed by the technology. Now, I would say don't be concerned at all. Just take your time, be patient, learn gradually, and within a short time you'll soon get used to the new camera. Let's be honest, behind all of the technology, a camera is just a box with a hole in the front. Now, I'd like to remind you that I'm an amateur photographer and I'm definitely not someone who revels in too much technical stuff, be that with the camera, the software, or the computer we use to bring our photography together. Okay, I suppose with a new camera we can't avoid a little technical talk, but I want to make it clear that I'm far more interested in the practical use of the camera and, more importantly, the quality images it can produce, with a little help from me, of course. You'll find that I don't exaggerate. In fact, I would probably understate rather than overstate. I think we have more than enough hype in this world already. After a few days of becoming acquainted with the camera, I did make a short video on my first experiences, and I'll link to that below. But now I've ventured out and I have pressed the shutter button a few times. So on a bright sunny Australian spring day around noon or just after, I went to Caloundra on the Sunshine Coast. It was pretty bad timing on my part, to be honest, to be out when the light is generally not the best for our photography. But the time to get out presented itself, and I think I was about ready to press that shutter button a few times. I had no intention of trying out every one of the camera's capabilities, so I just took the camera and a Canon 24-105 EF lens. The rest of my kit stayed at home. I needed the EF to RF adapter to enable me to use my existing lenses on the new camera body, but it isn't really a problem apart from adding just a couple of centimeters to the overall length of the lens. Now, given the sunny conditions and coastal location, I also decided to add a polarizing filter, and in fact it's about the only filter I own. The rest is just point and shoot. Now, the surprise with the Canon R5 is, well, there's not really a surprise. It's a flagship Canon camera, so realistically, what would we expect? It handles beautifully and the firing of the camera is very much quieter than we're used to because we don't have that mirror flipping up within the camera body. Just the delicate sound of the mechanical shutter. So I just walked around this part of Caloundra on the Sunshine Coast of Australia and just snapped a few pictures. Just keeping things simple, no bracketing of exposures, just allowing the camera to determine the exposure for me. From time to time I changed the ISO. I didn't really need to in such bright sunny conditions, but it will allow us to look at the resulting images a little bit later in Photoshop. More importantly, I wanted to become familiar with changing the ISO because that's something we need to do often and sometimes with the camera to our eye. There's more than one way to access the ISO and other options too. As we press the shutter button and the camera comes to life, it's right there on the touchscreen at the bottom right corner. All it requires is a couple of touches of our finger to make an adjustment. We can jump from 200 to 400 to 800 and beyond. We can very easily change the ISO and other functions with the camera to our eye, just by pressing the mode and multifunction button. That's that small button which sits between the small scroll wheel and the shutter button, just a little bit to our left. It's very easy to find even with the camera to our eye. Hit the button multiple times and you'll scroll through 5 of the options you're most likely to need, and they'll be quickly displayed in the viewfinder. Turn the small function wheel to make your selection, and then a light touch of the shutter release locks in that selection. The options are ISO, continuous shooting, one shot or servo, white balance and exposure compensation. All can be changed while we're looking through the viewfinder. These options are also displayed on the top plate LCD after hitting that multifunction button, and the LCD screen on the back of the camera. So really it's just a case of selecting your favourite method. So let's take a look at the first few images that I shot with the Canon R5. Now I have the C-RAW file format selected. I did mention that in my previous video. Remember too that this was far from a good day to choose, given the harsh midday sunlight. But it is what it is, and the camera performed beautifully. I set the ISO at 200 for most of the shots because I had a polarizer filter attached. But I took a few shots at 400 ISO and 1 or 2 at 1600 ISO. Now I think we have to be a little careful when we're viewing images from a new camera we've just spent a fair amount of money on. Let's be honest, we're all going to be pretty desperate to see evidence to justify our investment. And when we're desperate to see something, then sometimes we find what we're looking for, even when it's not there. It's a well-known human failing, but that same confirmation bias we all have was probably an evolutionary survival mechanism. I read that somewhere, so we're pretty well stuck with it. Having said that, I can instantly see an improvement from previous cameras, even with the thumbnails in Adobe's Bridge. Now it's true that I'm well used to viewing and evaluating images here, so I guess my eye is fairly well tuned, but the thumbnails, they look crisp and smooth. Now as you can see here, I've opened up into Adobe Camera Raw. The very first image I shot with this camera, apart from those I took from my armchair while learning the menus. Now there's two things that I notice with the image when we see it larger. First of all, the confirmation that the 45 megapixel sensor on the Canon R5 is delivering the goods, and I can see it with my naked eye on an unchanged image, a basic raw file. The only other thing I'm seeing here is a quite cool look to the colour, but that's going to be caused by the midday sun more than anything the camera is doing. A slight tweak of the temperature and we can soon have that corrected. Now I've just noticed if you look down at the bottom center of the screen, you can see that there's a hyperlink, and that hyperlink is saying that this image is 8-bit. In normal circumstances I would be working with my images in 16-bit. And I only changed this to 8-bit while I was doing some screen recordings of the menus from the R5. So let me go down to that hyperlink just for a moment. I just want to tick the box to make sure that I always open this as a smart object, and I'd like to do all of my processing as 16 bits per channel. And we can notice as I click OK that the pixel value with the images from the R5 are 8192 pixels by 5464. Now the file size is quite large here, 44.8. Remember, we are using the slightly smaller file size of C-RAW, so that's going to help us. Now as you can see, I've changed the image in Adobe Camera Raw, and if you look up at the top right just below the histogram, you'll notice that the ISO for this one was set at 400. 24 to 105mm lens as normal, but it was set at 47mm, 250th of a second at f8. So with the zoom tool selected, I'm going to click and drag. and we'll bring this up to something like 100% or a little more, and we can evaluate the noise in a shot from the Canon R5 with 400 ISO used. Now the noise I'm seeing in this image doesn't look too bad to me, but then again 400 ISO is not a high ISO by today's standards, and the thing which is most important when we're trying to defeat noise is trying to prevent it in the first place. But if we can't do that, then we have to make sure we don't underexpose any of the shadows, because if I was to try to bring up any detail from the really deep shadow in the bow of that boat, then we're going to see more effect of the noise than we see generally. Overall, it looks pretty good to me. If you'd like to see some of these images on your own computer, I've posted about 8 of these original raw images from this batch for you to download. You will find a link to those in the R5 menu on my website. There's nothing better than viewing images on your own computer. Let's take a look at a few of these images that I processed through Adobe Camera Raw. I've only applied light processing to these images, just color, contrast and clarity. But that is an important part of the evaluation process for me. To be able to get a feel for the new camera and its abilities, I need to take my images right through the process of taking, downloading them to the computer and processing them through, in my case, Adobe Camera Raw, but we could easily use Lightroom 2, of course. I haven't sharpened any of these images, but then again, I haven't sharpened images for many years now, and I see no reason to start now that I have 45 megapixels at my disposal. Now I must say that I did find it quite enjoyable to go out without a full camera bag full of equipment, just carrying one camera and a lens. I think it prevents us from getting sidetracked, and it certainly focuses the attention, I think. I think we need that when we're using a new, state-of-the-art camera that we're trying to learn. We need a bit of quality time to become acquainted, where slow, steady progress is the name of the game. I think the images shot at 200 ISO and those at 400 and even up to 1600 are going to be pretty difficult to tell apart even on a 27-inch monitor. Now with some careful exposure and noise suppression, I'm pretty sure I can go far higher than 1600 ISO, and I'll surely be trying that in the next few weeks. But the in-body image stabilization will help a lot, but we need to remember that that's designed to keep the camera still, not the subject. If we have a fast-moving subject, like a bird in flight, we're still going to require a fast shutter speed to freeze the action, and maybe we'll need a high ISO to be able to achieve that. I still have a way to go with many other aspects of the Canon R5, but my first impressions are all pretty good ones. I'll see you next time.